They called her the mechanic. For 18 months, she had worked in silence at Ramstein Air Base, fixing engines, calibrating instruments, and staying invisible. No one questioned why her hands moved with surgical precision around million-dollar aircraft. No one wondered why she could diagnose problems that stumped veteran technicians. But when enemy fighters breached German airspace and every pilot was either grounded or missing, she walked to the nearest F-16, climbed into the cockpit, and did something that would leave the entire base speechless. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because every story we share here deserves to be remembered. The morning of September 15th started like any other at Ramstein Air Base in southwestern Germany. The autumn mist hung low over the runways as maintenance crews began their daily routines. Among them was Elena Voss, a civilian contractor who had been assigned to the base's aircraft maintenance division. To most people, she was just another technician in olive green coveralls, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, grease stains on her hands that never quite washed clean. Elena had arrived at Ramstein without fanfare. Her paperwork was in order, her certifications current, but her background remained mysteriously thin. The personnel office had her listed as a former automotive mechanic from Munich, seeking stable work with the American military. Her supervisor, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had been skeptical at first. Female mechanics weren't uncommon, but something about Elena's quiet confidence had caught his attention. Within her first week, Elena had demonstrated an uncanny ability to troubleshoot complex avionics systems. When a troubled F-16's radar kept malfunctioning despite 3 different repair attempts, Elena had taken one look at the wiring harness and identified a microscopic fracture that had evaded detection. When an A-10 Thunderbolt's targeting computer began displaying erratic readings, she'd traced the problem to a loose connection that should have taken hours to find. How did you know where to look? Rodriguez had asked her after the third impossible diagnosis. Elena had simply shrugged, wiping her hands on a rag. Experience, she'd said in accented English. But experience like that didn't come from fixing cars in Munich. Rodriguez had made a note in her file, but Elena's work was so exemplary that he let his suspicions slide. Good mechanics were hard to find, and Elena Voss was the best he'd ever seen. The other technicians had mixed feelings about her. Some appreciated her expertise, especially when she could solve problems that had them stumped. Others resented her quiet authority, the way she could look at a diagnostic readout and immediately know what was wrong. But all of them had noticed one peculiar habit. Elena never worked on aircraft that were scheduled for combat missions. She handled routine maintenance, pre-flight inspections, and post-mission repairs. But whenever a jet was being prepped for an active sortie, she found other tasks to occupy her time. It's like she doesn't want to get too close to the action, Lieutenant Collins had observed to his wingman. Maybe she's squeamish about weapon systems. What they didn't know was that Elena's reluctance had nothing to do with squeamishness. Every time she ran her hands along the fuselage of an F-16 or checked the control surfaces of an A-10, memories flooded back. Memories of other aircraft, other missions, other lives that depended on split-second decisions at 30,000 feet. She left that world behind for reasons she couldn't share, and she intended to keep it that way. The crisis began at 0847 hours on that September morning. Elena was in Hangar 7, recalibrating the inertial navigation system on an F-16C that had been experiencing minor drift issues. The work required absolute precision, and she was deep in concentration when the base-wide alert klaxon began to wail. All personnel, this is not a drill, came the announcement over the intercom. Unknown aircraft have violated German airspace. All flight crews report to operations immediately. Elena looked up from her work, her hands still buried in the aircraft's electronics bay. Through the hangar's open doors, she could see pilots and ground crews running across the tarmac. F-16s were being prepped for emergency takeoff, their engines spinning up with the distinctive whine of military turbofans under stress. But something was wrong. Even from inside the hangar, Elena could hear the confusion in the voices outside. Radios crackled with urgent transmissions, and she caught fragments of conversations that made her blood run cold. Razor 3 is down, repeat. Razor 3 is down. Multiple bandits. Bearing 090. Angels 25. Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 6. I'm hit and losing hydraulics. Elena abandoned her tools and stepped outside. The scene that greeted her was chaos barely held in check. Ground crews were scrambling to arm and fuel every available aircraft, but the flight line looked suspiciously empty. Too empty. Master Sergeant Rodriguez spotted her and jogged over, his face grim. "Voss, get that F-16 airworthy now. We need every bird in the sky." "What's happening?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew. Russian fighters, maybe 8 of them, came screaming across the border about 20 minutes ago. They hit our forward patrol before anyone could react. Shot down 3 of our birds and damaged 2 more. The rest of our squadron was already out on a training exercise over the Baltic when this started, and they won't be back for another hour. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many pilots do we have available? Rodriguez's expression darkened further. That's the problem. Captain Morrison is in the hospital with appendicitis. Lieutenant Jackson crashed his motorcycle yesterday and has a broken leg. Thompson and Chun are stuck at Spangdahlem due to weather. We got exactly 2 pilots on base, and one of them is a trainee who's never seen combat. As if summoned by their conversation, Lieutenant Mark Stevens appeared at Rodriguez's shoulder. Stevens was young, maybe 25, with the kind of eager confidence that came from months of simulator training and very little real-world experience. His flight suit was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine. "Sergeant, is my bird ready?" Stevens asked. "I'm cleared for immediate takeoff." Rodriguez gestured toward the F-16 Elena had been working on. "She's yours, Lieutenant. But listen to me carefully. Those aren't training targets out there. These are experienced Russian pilots in state-of-the-art aircraft. Stay with your wingman, follow his lead, and don't try to be a hero." Stevens nodded, but Elena could see the excitement in his eyes. He was treating this like another training exercise, another chance to prove himself. She'd seen that look before, in other young pilots who thought they were invincible. Too many of them had learned otherwise. "Who's his wingman?" Elena asked quietly. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. "Major Patterson. 20-year veteran, solid pilot, but he's been flying at desk for the past 3 years. This is his first combat sortie in God knows how long." Elena watched as Stevens and Patterson strapped into their aircraft. Patterson looked calm, professional, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Stevens was all nervous energy, checking and rechecking his instruments with the obsessive thoroughness of someone trying to convince himself he was ready. The 2 F-16s taxied the runway and took off in a thunder of afterburners. Elena stood on the tarmac, watching their navigation lights disappear into gray morning sky. Around her, ground crews continued their frantic preparations, but she could see the worry in their faces. Everyone knew the mathematics of the situation. 2 American fighters against 8 Russian aircraft, with 1 pilot who'd never fired a shot in anger and another who hadn't seen combat in years. 15 minutes later, the radios brought the news everyone had been dreading. "Base, this is Viper 2, came Patterson's strained voice. "Viper 1 is down. Repeat, Lieutenant Stevens is down. I'm damaged and low on fuel. Multiple bandits still in the area, requesting immediate assistance." Elena closed her eyes. Stevens had lasted 15 minutes against professional military pilots. It might have been a record for someone with his experience level, but it was still a death sentence. "Viper 2, this is base," responded the tower. "What's your status?" "Left engine is gone. Hydraulics are failing. I can make it back, but I won't be combat effective." "And base, Patterson's voice dropped. These aren't just Russians. The lead aircraft has Syrian Air Force markings. This might be bigger than we thought. Elena felt a familiar cold knot forming in her stomach. Syrian pilots meant veterans of years of civil war, men who had learned to fly and fight in conditions that would break most Western pilots. Combined with Russian technology and training, they represented a threat that even experienced American air crews would struggle to handle. How long until reinforcements arrive? She asked Rodriguez. The master sergeant checked his watch. The squadron over the Baltic is still 45 minutes out minimum. Spangdahlem is sending aircraft, but they're dealing with the same weather that's keeping our people grounded. We might not see help for an hour. And the enemy? Intelligence says they're refueling from a tanker somewhere over Poland. They'll be back. Elena nodded slowly. She looked around the base, taking in the worried faces of ground crews, the empty hangars where aircraft should have been parked, the radio chatter that spoke of confusion and fear. Then she looked at the remaining F-16s on the flight line. Beautiful, deadly machines that were useless without trained pilots to fly them. She made her decision. Rodriguez, she said quietly, I need to borrow one of those aircraft. The master sergeant stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Voss, you're a mechanic. You don't just borrow a $40 million fighter jet. Trust me, Elena said, and something in her voice made Rodriguez take a step back. I know what I'm doing. Before he could respond, Elena was walking toward the nearest F-16, her stride purposeful and confident. She'd worked on this particular aircraft dozens of times, knew every bolt and wire in its construction. But more than that, she knew how it would feel when she wrapped her hands around the stick and felt the aircraft respond to her touch. Behind her, Rodriguez was shouting into his radio. Try to raise someone in authority who could either authorize or stop what was about to happen. But authorization would take time they didn't have, and Elena had already reached the aircraft. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Her hands moved automatically through the pre-flight checklist, flipping switches and checking displays with muscle memory that came from years of training and experience. Voss! Rodriguez had reached the base of the ladder. You can't do this. You're not qualified. You're not authorized. You're not even military. Elena paused in her preparations and looked down at him. For the first time since arriving at Ramstein, her carefully maintained facade cracked just enough to let something else show through. Rodriguez saw it in her eyes, the cold, calculating gaze of someone who had looked death in the face and made it blink first. Master Sergeant, she said in a voice that carried command authority despite her civilian coveralls. Those pilots out there are going to die unless someone stops those aircraft. You have two choices. You can spend the next 10 minutes trying to find someone with the authority to stop me, or you can help me save them. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. Then, almost against his will, he found himself asking, What do you need? Full weapons load. Air-to-air missiles, gun armed and loaded. And get me a helmet. The tower will never clear you for takeoff. Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. They will when they realize I'm their only option. 20 minutes later, an F-16C bearing the tail number 87-0257 taxied toward Ramstein's main runway. In the cockpit, Elena Voss made final adjustments to her flight gear. The helmet felt familiar on her head, the oxygen mask comfortable against her face. The aircraft systems hummed around her with electronic efficiency, every display green and ready. Tower, this is Viper 3, requesting immediate takeoff clearance, she transmitted. There was a long pause before the response came. Viper 3, we show no flight plan for your aircraft. What is your authorization? Tower, this is Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Viper 3 is clear for emergency combat sortie under Crisis Authority Bravo 7. She's your only available pilot. Another pause, longer this time. Elena could imagine the frantic conversations taking place in the control tower, the desperate calls to higher headquarters, seeking guidance that wouldn't come in time. Finally, the tower controller's voice returned, tight with resignation. Viper 3, you are cleared for takeoff. Be advised, hostile aircraft bearing 075 at Angels 20. Viper 2 is returning to base with battle damage. Good luck. Elena pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar kick of afterburners igniting. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with violent enthusiasm, pressing her back into the ejection seat as the aircraft clawed its way into the sky. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the gear leave the ground. She was flying again. The sensation was indescribable. For 18 months, she had denied herself this feeling, convinced herself that she could be satisfied with maintenance work and ground-bound responsibilities. But now, with the stick in her hands and the horizon ahead, Elena remembered why she had originally chosen this life. The F-16 climbed to the overcast at maximum rate, its radar sweeping the sky ahead. At 20,000 feet, Elena broke through the cloud layer into brilliant sunshine. Her radar display showed multiple contacts to the northeast. The returning enemy formation refueled and ready for another attack run. Viper 2, this is Viper 3, she transmitted. What's your position? Patterson's voice came back immediately, relief evident in his tone. Viper 3, I'm 20 miles southeast of base, bleeding fuel and barely staying airborne. Where'd you come from? Long story. Can you make it back? Yeah, but it's going to be close. Listen, these pilots are good. Better than anything I've seen in training. The lead bird took out Stevens with a shot I didn't even see coming. Elena checked her weapons display. 4 a.m., 120 AMRAAM missiles, 2 a.m. 9 Sidewinders, and 500 rounds of 20 millimeters ammunition. Against 8 enemy fighters, it wasn't much, but it would have to do. Copy that, Viper 2. Get back to base and let me handle this. Negative, Viper 3. You can't take on 8 bandits alone. I'll stay and provide support. Elena's voice hardened. Major Patterson, you have battle damage and are low on fuel. Return to base immediately. That's an order. There was silence on the radio. Patterson wasn't used to taking orders from unknown pilots, especially ones who weren't supposed to exist. But something in Elena's tone suggested that argument would be futile. Copy, Viper 3. Good hunting. Elena switched her attention to the radar display. The enemy formation was 15 miles out and closing fast. 8 aircraft in a combat spread, fly with a kind of disciplined coordination that spoke of extensive training and real combat experience. She began to climb, using the F-16 superior thrust-to-weight ratio to gain altitude advantage. Her mind shifted into combat mode, a state of heightened awareness that she had thought was lost forever. Time seemed to slow down as her senses sharpened. She could feel the aircraft responding to minute control inputs, could sense the subtle changes in engine tone that indicated optimal performance. Most importantly, she could visualize the developing tactical situation with the kind of three-dimensional clarity that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. The lead enemy aircraft was a Su-35, a formidable air superiority fighter that outclassed the F-16 in almost every measurable category. Faster, more maneuverable, carrying more weapons. On paper, it was a fight Elena couldn't win. But air combat wasn't fought on paper. It was fought with skill, experience, and the kind of tactical thinking that came from years of training and survival. Elena began her approach from above and behind, using the sun to mask her position. The enemy formation was maintaining radio silence, but their flight pattern suggested they were preparing for another attack run on the base. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be in position to launch their assault. At 8 miles, her radar achieved lock on the trailing aircraft. Elena armed her first AMRAAM and waited for the optimal firing solution. In air combat, patience was often the difference between victory and death. Fire too early, and the enemy had time to react. Fire too late, and you might not get another chance. 7 miles. 6. 5. Elena squeezed the trigger. The AMRAAM dropped from its pylon and ignited, accelerating to over 3 times the speed of sound as it streaked toward its target. The missile's active radar seeker acquired the enemy aircraft and began final guidance calculations. The reaction was immediate. The enemy formation scattered like startled birds, each aircraft breaking in a different direction as their radar warning receivers screamed alerts. But the AMRAAM was already committed, and its target, a MiG-29 with Syrian markings, was too slow to escape. The explosion lit up the morning sky. Elena was already moving, banking hard left to engage the next target, while staying clear of the inevitable missile response. Her radar warning receiver was lit up like a Christmas tree as multiple enemy aircraft attempted to lock onto her position. She deployed chaff and flares while diving toward the cloud deck, using the overcast as concealment. A Russian R-77 missile streaked past her canopy, missing by less than 100 meters. Elena rolled inverted and pulled hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat as the F-16 executed a punishing evasive maneuver. Her vision grayed at the edges, but her training held. She'd endured worse. Breaking through the clouds, Elena found herself in perfect position to engage another enemy aircraft. A Su-35 was climbing to regain altitude, its pilot apparently assuming she had fled. Elena lined up a sidewinder shot and fired. The heat-seeking missile tracked perfectly, detonating against the Russian fighter's left engine. The Su-35 began streaming flame and smoke, its pilot ejecting second before the aircraft exploded. 2 down, 6 to go. But now the remaining enemy pilots knew they were facing someone who knew what they were doing. The scattered formation began to coalesce into a coordinated attack, with multiple aircraft attempting to bracket Elena's position. She found herself fighting for her life as missiles and cannon fire filled the air around her. The next few minutes were a blur of violent maneuvers and split-second decisions. Elena used every trick she had learned in years of combat flying, diving into valleys to break radar lock, using terrain masking to avoid missiles, exploiting the F-16's superior turn rate to stay inside the engagement envelope of larger, faster aircraft. She fired her remaining AMRAAMs at maximum range, forcing the enemy to go defensive and disrupting their coordinated attack. One missile found its mark, sending a MiG-29 spiraling toward the ground in flames. Another missile missed, but its proximity detonation damaged a Su-35 badly enough to force its pilot to withdraw from the engagement. Now it was 4 against 1, and Elena was running low on both fuel and missiles. Her sidewinders were gone, expended in a close-range engagement that had ended with another enemy aircraft destroyed, but had left her aircraft damaged. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, and she could feel a slight vibration in the stick that suggested structural damage. The remaining enemy pilots pressed their attack with renewed determination. They had lost half their force to a single American fighter, and their mission was turning into a disaster. But they were still experienced combat pilots flying superior aircraft, and Elena was running out of options. A cannon burst from a Su-35 stitched holes across her left wing. Another enemy fighter was positioning for a missile shot that she might not be able to evade. Elena's radar warning receiver was screaming continuously now, and she could see tracer rounds streaking past her canopy. That's when the cavalry arrived. Viper 3. This is Eagle Lee with 8 birds. Angels 25, 5 miles southeast of your position. Elena had never heard a more beautiful sound. The reinforcements from the Baltic exercise had arrived early, and they were coming in hot. 8 F-16s in full combat configuration, piloted by experienced air crews who have been monitoring the engagement on their radios. Eagle lead, Viper 3. I'm engaged with 4 bandits, low on fuel and ammunition. Could use some assistance. Roger that, Viper 3. We have you on scope. Brake right and climb. We'll take it from here. Elena pulled back on the stick and felt the battered F-16 respond sluggishly, but was enough to clear the engagement area as the fresh American fighters swept in like avenging angels. The remaining enemy aircraft, faced with overwhelming odds, turned and fled toward the Polish border. The engagement was over. Elena nursed her damaged aircraft back to Ramstein, where emergency crews were waiting on the runway. She brought the F-16 in on a straight-in approach, fighting a sick engine and degraded flight controls. The landing was harder than she would have preferred, but she managed to keep the aircraft on the center line until it rolled to a stop. As the canopy opened and Elena climbed out of the cockpit, she found herself facing a crowd of ground crews, pilots, and officers. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was there, along with Base Commander Colonel James Mitchell, whom Elena had never actually met. But it was Rodriguez who spoke first. For enemy aircraft destroyed, he announced to the assembled crowd, "Mission accomplished." A cheer went up from the ground crews, but Elena wasn't paying attention. She was staring at the damaged F-16, mentally cataloging the repairs that would be needed to get it airworthy again. Old habits died hard. Colonel Mitchell approached her, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Voss, I think we need to have a conversation." Elena nodded, suddenly feeling every one of her 32 years. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and the familiar emptiness that always followed combat. "Yes, sir." They walked to Mitchell's office in silence, past curious stares and whispered conversations. Elena knew that her carefully constructed civilian identity was finished. There would be questions now, investigations, background checks that would eventually uncover the truth she had tried so hard to bury. In the office, Mitchell gestured for her to sit, then took his place behind the desk. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Elena Voss," he began, "civilian aircraft mechanic from Munich. Except that's not really who you are, is it?" Elena said nothing. Mitchell opened a file folder and began reading. "Captain Elena Ghost Kozlov, formerly of the 64th Aggressor Squadron. Graduated from the Top Gun program with distinction. 73 combat missions over Syria and Afghanistan. 18 confirmed air-to-air kills. Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster. Silver Star for actions above and beyond the call of duty." He looked up at her. "You died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Officially." Elena finally spoke. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "Really?" "Because 4 dead enemy pilots might disagree with you." They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Mitchell closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The official report of today's engagement will show that an unidentified pilot, flying under emergency authority, successfully defended this base against enemy attack until reinforcements could arrive. The pilot's identity will remain classified. Elena looked up, surprised. "However," Mitchell continued, "I'm going to need that pilot to stick around. It seems we have an opening for an experienced flight instructor." For the first time in 3 years, Elena smiled. It wasn't a big smile, barely visible, but it was genuine. "I'll need to finish fixing that F-16 first," she said. Mitchell laughed. "I think we can find someone else to handle the maintenance work. You've got more important things to do." As Elena left the office, she could hear the sounds of normal base operations resuming around her. Aircraft engines, radio chatter, the everyday noise of military life continuing. But something had changed. For 18 months, she had hidden from who she really was. Convinced that Elena Kozlov was dead and buried, Today, she had remembered that some things, duty, honor, the willingness to risk everything for others, never really die. They just wait for the right moment to return. 3 weeks later, Captain Elena Kozlov stood in front of a classroom full of young pilots, officially reinstated to active duty and assigned to the base's pilot training program. Her students didn't know about the engagement that had brought her back from the dead. All they knew was that their instructor had a reputation for turning good pilots into exceptional ones, and that she never seemed to smile, except when someone did something particularly impressive in the air. But Master Sergeant Rodriguez knew, and sometimes, when he watched her working with the new pilots, he would remember the morning when a mechanic had saved their base, and he would smile, because some stories deserve to be remembered, even if they can never be officially told.